Hello, I am an amateur photographer who usually takes pictures of sports and wildlife. I've always been interested in pictures of the Milky Way and galaxies and nebula, and I've recently started my astrophotography journey. And I've watched a lot of videos on YouTube and read a lot of blogs, and I thought I would post my own video sharing my journey and a lot of the mistakes that I've made along the way. I do not get any money from any of the suppliers or vendors that I mention in this video. The first rule of taking astrophotography is, of course, you need dark skies. Some people are fortunate enough that they live in areas where they can go out into their backyards and take pictures. My neighborhood has a lot of streetlights, and so I have to drive about an hour and a half to find dark skies. There are a couple different websites you can use for finding dark skies or a light pollution map. There are also free apps you can get for your phone. Major cities are in the gray, and as you travel into the suburbs, the color shading changes, and then when you get out in the light green and dark green, even blue areas, that's where you're going to get your best pictures. So once you know where you need to travel to take the pictures, now you need to know when. There is a website called Capture the Atlas, and around mid-January of every year, they publish a free calendar for when the best time is to take Milky Way pictures. And so if you look at the first couple rows of 2023, it's full moon. You're not going to get Milky Way pictures because of the light pollution from the moon. You'd be surprised if you've never gone out into dark skies before how bright it actually is without even the moon out. And so once the moon is there, it completely washes out the Milky Way. The light blue areas, so you can see here 0% because it's a new moon or the moon is under the horizon, but you only have 44 minutes available to capture the Milky Way before it rotates and it ends up setting. When I first started trying my hand at Milky Way photography, this was a very, very useful tool. And I was so excited that in early January, I grabbed my camera and my tripod. I went out to dark skies and tried to take a picture, and it didn't work. The reason for that is I concentrated on these columns, and I forgot to look at the column over here at the end. I live west of Miami, so shooting eastward, I'm getting light pollution from Miami, even though I'm in dark skies. And the reason I had issues is because at the beginning of the year, the Milky Way is in the east and it's barely over the horizon. And so when I was trying to shoot this, the Milky Way was visible, but when you take a longer exposure, the light pollution bleeds upwards and it ruined the picture. So I needed to wait till later in the year when the Milky Way was a little bit higher. Where I am in North America, it rose in the east and then it rotates and basically sets in the southwest. And so the beginning of the year is not good for me because it's rising in the east, and again I've got that light pollution coming from Miami. This is a very, very valuable tool. And like I said, around mid-January, Capture the Atlas publishes it. So now you know where to go and when to go. What settings do you need to take a Milky Way picture? Well, the first thing is focal length. You want a wide, fast lens. If you shoot at 50 millimeters or more, you're going to be so zoomed in, you're not going to get that nice arch from the Milky Way. you want something maybe around 20 millimeters or even less to get a nice wide angle picture. The f-stop, you want the lowest you can get. So an f2.8, that's very good. It's going to let in a lot more light than, let's say, an f4 or an f5.6 lens, and therefore you can take a shorter exposure. The ISO, well, that depends on your camera. Some can handle higher ISOs better than others. I have a Canon 7D. I like to stay at 3200. If you have a slow lens like f4 or f5.6, you might have to bump up your ISO to 6400. That lets in more light, but it also lets in more noise. So when you look at your picture, it might seem a little pixelated in certain areas. Shutter speed is a little bit harder to talk about here because it depends on the lens that you're shooting. If you take a long exposure, you're going to see star trails. And the rule of thumb so that you don't see these star trails is something called the 500 rule. And what that says is you take 500 divided by your focal length, and that's how many seconds you can take a picture before you see star trails. So you've got a 50 millimeter lens, that ends up being 10 seconds. It's a rule of thumb. This is not a hard, straight fact because it depends on the sensor on your camera. If I go out with my Canon and I shoot for 10 seconds, I get star trails. I even get them at 8 seconds. So there's some people that use 400 instead of 500. There are also formulas you can use on websites to give you a much more accurate estimate. You have to input in information about your camera and your sensor and so forth. Sometimes you do want to get star trails for neat effects in your pictures, but when you're doing Milky Way pictures, you usually don't. The other thing to keep in mind is that here in North America, we're rotating around the celestial pole. And if you're aiming your camera more towards the center, the stars appear to be rotating slower than the ones on the outside. And the 500 rule really doesn't take that into account. The other part of planning is where and when you're going to shoot. So you've got dark skies and you know the Milky Way is going to be visible, but the best Milky Way pictures have something interesting in the foreground. An abandoned barn, an old rusty out car, a mountain. And there's an app that most astrophotographers use called PhotoPills. It's around $11, but it's well worth it. If you're traveling to Denver and you want to shoot the Milky Way in the valley of some mountains, you can go into PhotoPills and it will tell you when and where you want to be to get that picture. Maybe you want to take a picture of your house with the full moon behind it. This will help you plan for that. So it's a very, very useful app. Most astrophotographers that you talk to, like I mentioned, one of the first things they'll recommend is getting PhotoPills. So my camera is a 7D, and as I mentioned, it doesn't really do good at high ISOs. And so I started taking shorter Milky Way pictures, 5 seconds, 6 seconds, and I wasn't getting a lot of detail, so I had to bump up the ISO, and then I started getting a lot of noise. So what I needed to do was find a way I could take longer exposures, but without the star trails. And that's when a star tracker comes into play. And the first one I got was something called the Move Shoot Move. This is a lightweight box you can see here. You mount it on your existing tripod, and then you attach your ball head and your camera. And what happens is you aim the Move Shoot Move at Polaris, at the celestial pole, and this will actually slowly rotate so that you can take a longer exposure without getting star trails. And you have different options when you buy the Move Shoot Move. I went for the full kit. So I got the Move Shoot Move, and down here this is a laser pointer. And what happens is at night you turn this on, and as long as there's nobody in your way, there's no airplanes in the sky, you turn this on and you put the laser on Polaris, the North Star. And then that way you can then aim your camera at where the Milky Way is. And like I mentioned, this will slowly rotate and allow you to take that longer exposure. The more accurate you are with your alignment, the better your pictures are going to be. And so if you just use the green laser, you're roughly aligned with Polaris when you get it dead on. However, if you want to fine tune it, you can optionally get the visual scope. And so when you look inside this scope, it's going to give you what's called a clock, and you can align it more accurately with Polaris. Therefore, you can take a 15-second picture and not get star trails. My problem is that this is a Vanguard ball head, and I've had issues where if I set up my camera like this on an angle, the force of gravity pulling down on my lens and my camera actually slips in my ball head. So I actually need to get a new one because this one keeps slipping. The Move Shoot Move can hold a little over 6.5 pounds. So you can put your camera on here, and you can put your fast wide-angle lens. You cannot use a long lens. You put a 200 millimeter lens on here and it's not going to work. It's not designed to hold that kind of weight. It's not going to be balanced. So as I mentioned, you really need a good ball head to put your camera on, because you're going to be sitting there for around 10 seconds. Mine keeps slipping, and so I wasn't able to use the Move Shoot Move to the best of its ability. You also want to get something called a polar clock for your phone. And what happens is when you look through the visual scope of the Move Shoot Move, you see a target like this. And what you want to do is you use the app to say, okay, here's Polaris. Polaris is a bright star close to the celestial pole. And what happens is you put Polaris in the visual scope just like you see it here in the app, and then you know you're dead on with Polaris. As the night goes on, you're going to see this slowly go around, and so you might need to make some adjustments with your setup and refocus and re-aim or recalibrate where Polaris is lined up with the Move Shoot Move. So I was able to go out and take some pictures, but the problem was, like I mentioned, my ball head kept slipping. And I decided, what I'd really like to do is take some pictures of nebula and some galaxies, maybe even some planets. I don't live in an area with a mountain range or an old church or something that would make an interesting foreground to taking pictures of the Milky Way, so I thought I would move on to other deep sky objects. So what do you need to be able to do that? Well, the Andromeda Galaxy, you really need something around 200 to 400 millimeters focal length for your lens. A lot of nebula can be captured just at 200 millimeters. You're talking about huge objects in space. So you don't need a really powerful super lens to take a lot of pictures. The problem, if you think about it, the Move Shoot Move can't handle a big lens like this. And so if you shoot without a star tracker, you'll start getting star trails, like I mentioned. So I needed to look at a more powerful star tracking mount. Now, for taking pictures of planets, now you're talking about a whole different type of astrophotography. Even though the planets are closer than nebula, they're very tiny in comparison, and they're moving a lot quicker. So for something like Saturn, you might need a 1,000 or 2,000 millimeter focal length telescope to take pictures of it. But as I said, the planets are moving around very quickly, and they're also revolving. And so what a lot of people do is they actually take short movies and they use special programs to extract frames and stack them together, and then that's how they get their pictures of the planets. The other question is, what do you want to do with these pictures? Are you just posting it to social media? Do you want to make large prints and put them in your house? That really determines the type of camera and the quality that you want to get from your pictures. So I needed a better tracking mount, something that can hold my camera and my zoom lens. And so I did some research, and I discovered something called the HEQ5 Pro mount. This includes the tripod, it includes the mount itself, and it also has something called Go-To. This is a very good mid-range mount. You mount your camera and your lens up here. These are counterweights, so that as it's rotating, it can handle the higher weight. But what was really cool with Go-To, I don't know the night sky that well. I can tell the mount, go to the Andromeda galaxy, and it will automatically go to it. Now the problem is that this is around $1,400 new, but I got mine used for $900, and so I got pretty lucky there. The next model up from the HEQ5 Pro is the EQ6. Now the EQ6 can hold more equipment, but it's also a lot heavier. And you can see that the 6 actually has a handle here because it is so heavy, 38 pounds. At the time that I found mine used, there was also somebody local selling the EQ6 used at the same price, $900. But it was a little bit older, and as I mentioned, it's a lot heavier. The HEQ5 can hold 30 pounds. So that could easily hold my camera and my lens. If I ever wanted to upgrade to a telescope, it could handle a smaller telescope. So I didn't want to deal with the much larger and heavier mount that the EQ6 is. Now, where do you get equipment? Well, like I mentioned, I bought mine used. And I highly recommend a website called Cloudy Nights. On Cloudy Nights, it's free to join, and they have a classified section where you can look for equipment. Now, you've got to remember that these things are heavy, these mounts. So if there's somebody across the country and they're willing to offer you their mount at a great price, you've got to keep in mind it's got to be boxed up and shipped to you, which could be a lot of money. So when you do use classifieds, just keep an eye on location. I was fortunate, like I said, I found somebody local that I could just drive and meet them somewhere public and exchange money for the mount, and I was good to go. There are a lot of places that you can go to buy camera equipment and telescope equipment. B&H is a popular site to buy camera gear. They also have some astrophotography gear. High Point Scientific is one of the more popular astrophotography websites. They have a lot of telescopes and dedicated cameras. And then obviously there's Amazon. My mount requires an external power supply, and I picked mine up from Amazon. Whenever you buy something from Amazon, be careful though. They are not always the lowest price. And I use a site called Price Camel. And what you do with Price Camel is you enter in what you're looking to buy from Amazon, and as you can see here, it'll show you the price history. So if something frequently goes on sale, you don't want to buy it when it's at the most expensive. If you can wait until it goes on sale, And this is a very, very powerful shopping tool to have at your exposure. My mount, as I mentioned, can hold 30 pounds. And I thought, oh, I'm good for the future. Well, that 30-pound max payload is for visual astronomy. So if you put a telescope on here and you're just looking through an eyepiece, if it shakes a little bit, if it slips a little bit, that's not a big deal. You're just looking at it with your eyes. If you're going to be taking pictures, then that's a different story. And on the cloudy nights on the forums, I was asking about this max payload. Excuse me. And one of the things that was shared with me is take this value that they tell you and half it. So if it says it has a payload of 30 pounds for astrophotography, don't go over 15. I thought that was a little strange, so I reached out to Skywatcher, the company that makes the mount, and they came back and they said, well, you could load it up to 30, but when you get to 20, that's a bit much. Half the weight is old school to use that rule. Well, 15, 20 pounds, that's pretty close to each other. It's still not the 30 that is advertised. For me, I'm fine right now with my camera and my lens. I've only got 5 pounds there. That's not a big deal. But again, just thinking about the future. So keep that in mind when you start looking at mounts. One of the things about astrophotography is that it can be a very frustrating hobby, but it can also be extremely expensive. I didn't want to get a little bit of a better mount, a little bit of a better mount, a little bit better mount. I figured I would bite the bullet, get something that's really good now, and then I wouldn't have to worry about upgrading in the future. Something else I discovered was that the mount is designed for a telescope. Up here is where you mount it with a mounting plate. This is not a camera tripod that you just screw your camera in. You need to attach a plate up here, and then these are tightening bolts. And so what I had to do was buy an adapter for my lens. I had to buy a mounting plate that then attaches to the mount. The problem is they come in all different shapes, all different sizes, short ones, longer ones. You can see the mounting grooves and the holes are different with them. I ended up, I would say, spending about $100 on different mounting plates and different screws. Because the problem was, you take a screw and you put it through the mounting plate and attach it to the tripod collar here. So the screw has to be long enough to go into the plate and attach to the tripod mount. So if it's too short, obviously it won't attach, but if it's too long, what happens is it can only go so far into the tripod collar here, and so the screw itself can be tight, but there could be a lot of room left, and the mounting plate here can still be loose and wiggle. And so you could turn the mounting plate until it's tight, but then you get this situation where it's not straight. It's off on an angle. And I had no idea what I was doing wrong. I went on cloudy nights. I talked to a few people on there. It turned out I needed to get a different size screw. My screw was too long. So went back to Amazon. I bought a set of different screws of different lengths, and eventually I was able to attach it correctly. That was something that I didn't see in other videos that talk about taking Milky Way photography, and it was extremely frustrating. Okay, so now I've got a bigger mount. I can use my big zoom lens. Now I got to figure out what I'm going to take a picture of. There are a lot of different sites that help with planning. The first thing is what's the weather going to be like? When you go out to dark skies, it doesn't mean it's not going to be cloudy out. So There's a site called Astrophotography that I use. There are a couple different ones out there that will tell you the forecast if it's supposed to be cloudy or not. The darker the blue, the less cloudy. So obviously you can see here Friday the 26th, it was way too cloudy to take pictures. Even if there's no clouds in the sky, it doesn't mean it's going to be conducive to taking astrophotography pictures, because it can be hazy out. If there's a lot of moisture in the air, I live in South Florida, we have a lot of humidity, not a cloud in the sky, but if there's haze, it's going to be difficult to take pictures of deep sky objects. And so you use astrophotography to help plan it out. Now, this isn't perfect. There have been times where the forecast is clear. It's supposed to be a good night to take pictures. I drive an hour and a half to my location that I take pictures at, and it starts raining, or clouds come in. Weather changes. Winds shift, and what was a clear night could end up being a cloudy night. So you just need to keep an eye on the conditions, not just of where you're at, but of the winds and what's supposed to happen hours from now. The other thing that you want to take a look at is what you're going to be taking pictures of. And so you can go through and you can say, well, what's going to be a good object for me a good subject to take pictures of, like the Orion Nebula or the Andromeda Galaxy. There are a couple different tools like Stellarium where you can search or manually zoom in and out and see the different objects that are going to be in the sky. You can be very specific. Maybe there's a quarter moon out, and so you want to make sure when you're searching for objects that you want something that's going to be 30 degrees away from the moon and be above the horizon for 3 hours. And it'll come back, and you can use websites to actually plan out your evening before you go out. The other thing that's really cool is astronomy tools. Maybe with your lens, you want to take a picture of the Pinwheel Galaxy. Well, with the astronomy tools tool set, you can input in your camera and your lens, and it will show you the field of view. This is what it would look like if you take a picture. Well, that galaxy is kind of tiny. Maybe I need to go to the next thing on the list and see what that would look like with my equipment. So you can plan everything out before you head out. The other thing you have to keep in mind is that you're taking pictures of objects very far away, and so you're taking much longer pictures. It's very risky to take a photograph that's an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours long. Excuse me. If you think about it, maybe an airplane gets in your field of view, or you see these little green things right here? Those are Starlink satellites. Well, you don't want to have a long exposure and have 20 different Starlink satellites go through your image, because you're going to get white lines from them passing. And so instead of taking hour-long images, what you can do is take shorter images and then stack them together. And there's a lot of different software that you can use to stack the things together. But you want to take maybe 2-minute, 5-minute pictures, and then take 20, 30, 100 of them, and then you can stack them together. The other part of doing stacking is something called calibration frames. When your image sensor is taking a lot of pictures, it's going to heat up, and when it heats up, you can get noise. Or maybe you've got some dust on your sensor or on your lens that you weren't aware of. These calibration frames help adjust for that. So light frames are the normal pictures that you're taking of the night sky. Then there are dark frames. With dark frames, you put your lens cap on and you keep everything else the same. The ISO and the focus and the shutter speed. You take a bunch of these dark frames, and then when you put it into the stacking software, it will use those, and if you have noise in your image, it'll help weed that out, because the dark picture will then show where you have hot pixels or some noise. Bias frames, very similar to the dark frames. You leave the lens cap on, same ISO and same focus, only now you use the fastest shutter speed that you have. And then finally, also important are the flat frames. Very similar to dark frames, flat frames are used to help identify any dust or noise with your sensor. What you want to do here is you aim your lens straight up, you cover it with a white t-shirt that you've pulled tight, you put a light panel, an evenly lit light panel on top of that, and then you take a picture so that the histogram is roughly in the middle. So you might only need to take a picture at, let's say, 125 or 250th of a second. The amount of frames that you take, really up to you. If I take 50 light frames as an example, I might only take 10 dark biased and 10 light frames. You really don't want to go overboard and take like 50. Usually around 10 or so is quite enough. So next step. So now I've got my camera, my big lens, and a really good mount. Well, as I mentioned, this mount has something called go-to. And what you do is you line it up to Polaris, just like you do with the Move Shoot Move. Excuse me. And then you use the keypad to say, I want to go to the Orion Nebula. And it will automatically turn and point at the Orion Nebula. But the problem is, part of the initial setup is something called star alignment. You tell it that it's lined up on Polaris, and then what it wants to do is rotate to a bright star that's nearby, and it will say to you, I think I'm pointing at such and such a star. Am I? Is it centered? And you have to use the hand controller to line it up perfectly and tell it, yes, you're lined up correctly. My problem is I'm looking at the back of a camera at night, looking at white dots in the sky, and I had a lot of trouble doing the star alignment. I ended up getting something called the ASI Air Plus. What this is, it's a tiny little control box that you plug your mount into, and you use something called a guide camera, and that assists you with everything. And so what happens is you plug your camera, you plug your mount, you plug your guide camera all into this control box. And now this control box controls the whole thing for you. So the screenshot over here is doing polar alignment. I don't have to look through here and try to line it up to Polaris. The box helps me do it. So in this case, it's saying I need to raise my telescope a few degrees because Polaris is down here. I adjust the telescope so it's aimed a little bit up. I'll see that blue circle jump up to here, maybe shift it a little bit to the right, and I'll be right on, and my polar alignment will be exact. And then I can go into the app, and I can say I want to do the Andromeda Galaxy, Orion Nebula, whatever. It will automatically turn, center, take a picture, verify that it's centered, and then it will tell me I'm good to go for my picture session. This is amazing. It's a game changer. Highly recommend it. If you're going to go with a big mount like I have, make it easy. Go ahead and invest in getting the ASI Air Plus. And if it's a little bit too expensive, well, then you go on cloudy nights and you can get a used one. It's very small, as you can see, so shipping this across the country is not as big of a deal as obviously shipping a big mount like this. Some tips. Okay, so you know where you're going to go, when you're going to go, and what you're going to take pictures of. One of the mistakes I've made is I forget stuff at home. So as an example, my mount has a counterweight. Well, I forgot this counterweight once. So I drove all the way out there, unpacked, set up, and then I realized I forgot it. I had to load everything back in the car and drive home. I wasted 3 hours, and I wasted a good night for astrophotography. Make a checklist so you don't forget any equipment. And when you're starting out, make a checklist so you don't miss any steps as you're going through the setup. Another example is when you set your mount up, I was set up on the ground. And so I learned the hard way, bring a level so you can make sure everything is nice and level before you put all your equipment on top of it. Focus mask. If you're using a camera lens like I am, it can be very difficult to look at the back of your camera's LCD and focus on stars. With a focus mask, you put it in front of your lens, you take a picture, and you'll see these spikes on bright stars. And if that center spike is a little bit off one way or the other, you know you're out of focus. When it's dead center, that means you're focused. So you set up your equipment, you get polar aligned, you go to a bright star, check your focus, and then once your focus is good, then go to the actual object that you want to take pictures of. Put down a drop cloth. So you're sitting there, you're maybe in a field, and you set up and you drop something. And now you're feeling around trying to find a little tiny screw or something. A lot of folks will put down a white drop cloth, like a painting drop cloth, so that if they drop something, it's easier for them to find it. You might be taking pictures for several hours, so if you have a folding chair or maybe a small table, you can actually be comfortable while you're taking your pictures. Know your surroundings. If you have to venture out like I do, you really need to know where it is you're going to take your pictures. If there's let's say there's a park, well, some parks close at sunset. Some parks require you to have a camping permit if you're going to stay there overnight to take astrophotography. Obviously, you don't want to go on somebody's private property without their permission. And you also want to keep an eye out on the weather. In the winter, throw an extra jacket in the car. Bring a bottle of water in case you get thirsty. No white lights. Buy a red light flashlight. This is a big one. If you're out there with some friends and everybody sets up their equipment and they're taking pictures and you decide you're going to leave, you open up your car door, white light floods the area and ruins everybody's night vision. Or you start your car and the headlights automatically come on and wash everything out and everybody gets upset because their pictures are ruined. So get a red light flashlight. If you're going to be parking with a lot of other people, park off to the side, keep all the cars together, and then maybe walk 20 yards and set up your equipment. Look for local astronomy clubs and join cloudy nights. It's always more fun to do this with a group of people, and astronomy clubs are a great place to meet people. I've learned a lot by just talking to other astrophotographers that are in my area. Keep everything together in a go box. You don't want to forget things, even if you have a checklist. Have a box where you keep all of your screwdrivers and pliers and extra tape, Velcro strips, glow strips, whatever. Having everything together in a box is helpful if the weather changes and goes from not so great to great. If you have everything already together, you can just throw it in your car and go. Make sure everything is charged up. And as I mentioned at the beginning, there are a lot of great videos on YouTube where you can learn a lot. Taking the pictures is the first step. Processing is the next step. You can take 2 hours worth of pictures and have to spend another 2 hours in post-processing making the pictures pop. Whether you use PixInsight or Photoshop, GIMP, some other program, you can end up spending a lot of time fine-tuning it after the fact. So my journey so far. So the pros, I'm using all ZWO products. The Air Plus controller box that I mentioned only works with their cameras. Some people, instead of using the Air Plus like I'm using, they just use a laptop. They plug their laptop with adapters into their mount and their cameras, and they control everything on their laptop. The problem, of course, is that you're taking this laptop with you, and so you probably want to bring out a table or something. You also have to make sure the software is up to date, your drivers are up to date, and it can be a mess. So I'm in one ecosystem, like using Apple products. I don't have to worry about anything because they're designed to all work together. The downside is that I am locked into their ecosystem. So you can't use excuse me, you can't use a non-ZWO camera with the Air Plus. And not a big deal, but it is something to keep in mind. One of the cameras that they have is called the 2600. This is probably the top of the line amateur color camera that they have. There was a problem a couple years ago where there was some oil leakage inside the camera and it was leaking onto the sensor. It's been fixed, but you need to be aware of this if you want to go with ZWO and buy a used 2600. You want to make sure it's not one of the ones that had the problem. The other thing you don't see a lot of people talking about is ZWO is a Chinese company. In the US, there's been a lot of talk about blocking TikTok because of it tracking people. Well, the ASI Air app has some issues. When I installed it, I got warnings saying that it is tracking and the data is not encrypted. ZWO has come out saying they don't share their data with anybody else, but you need to be aware it knows where you are, what you're taking pictures of. If you're using it on your phone instead of a tablet, it might have access to your phone number. The Asia Air is kind of like, if you've ever heard of a Raspberry Pi, a small controller box. People have tried to look at the software on the Air Plus to actually see what it's doing, but it's all locked out. It's a big black box and nobody knows what's going on in there. So if you're very concerned about security, it might be something you want to look into. So what comes next? So I've been using my Canon zoom lens and my camera DSLR, my 7D. A regular digital camera is not as good as a modified digital camera. There are kits you can buy, or you can send your camera away and have it be modified to take better astrophotography pictures by modifying your sensor. Of course, then it becomes a dedicated astrophotography camera. So some people might buy like a Canon TI, cheaper digital camera, and have it be modified. Other people buy dedicated astronomy cameras. And what's neat about these is that some of them are cooled so that if you're taking a lot of pictures at night, you don't have to worry about the sensor overheating and beginning to get noisier and noisier as the evening goes on and you use the camera more. These dedicated cameras can be a little bit expensive. The top of the line color camera by ZWO could run you $3,000. The 2600 that I mentioned, that's $1,800. The next level down, they have the 533 and the 183. And as you can see, they're both at the $800 price point. The 533 has better reviews than the 183. The thing about the 533 is, if you look here at this picture from Astronomy Tools, the 533 has a square sensor. It's not rectangular like a regular digital camera that you're used to. Some people get hung up on that. Other people don't. The 533 has better reviews and better features than the 183, but you have to deal with that square sensor. What's really nice about the ASI Air app is when you go take a picture of something like a galaxy like this, you can actually move and rotate in the app, and it will actually turn the camera and the telescope so that you can reposition and take the picture that you want. What you're seeing here in Astronomy Tools is not what you have to take a picture of. You could take this blue box in the app, rotate it 45 degrees, and get the whole galaxy in that one picture. What about lenses? Well, a digital camera zoom lens is not as good as a prime lens. So if you think about a 100 to 400 zoom lens like I'm using, a prime lens like a 600 is going to be better quality glass. Better than a digital camera prime lens is an astrograph. An astrograph is a smaller telescope designed for astrophotography. ZWO has a new line of telescopes that they've come out with, astrographs, from 1,000 millimeters down to a 416. So it depends on how much you're willing to spend, but also what you want to take pictures of. Like I mentioned at the beginning, what are you trying to accomplish? If you look at these examples here, like the Horsehead Nebula, very popular subject for new astrophotographers. So at 400 millimeters, you can get the whole nebula in there. If you go to 600, you can see you can zoom in a little bit. At 1,000, you can really get a nice shot of the Horsehead. The Rosette Nebula, you can see the difference here between 400 and 600. So it depends what you're shooting. If you want to take the Andromeda Galaxy at more than 400 millimeters, you're going to start cutting off the arms of the galaxy. So if you've got the 107 or the 130 at these higher focal lengths, you're going to be trimming off part of the galaxy. So you've got to keep that in mind. Now what you can get is something called a reducer. So as an example, the ZWO 80 millimeter lens, it's got a 600 millimeter focal length. That, like I mentioned, is going to cut off the arms of the Andromeda Galaxy. You can add an optional reducer. What this does is it takes the focal length down, in this case to around 450. It also lets in more light, so you can take shorter exposures if you need to. And it will allow you to take a picture of Andromeda without cutting off the edges. And as you can see here, you got to keep an eye out on the weight depending on what mount you have. So my mount is advertised at having a 30-pound weight limit. It's advisable not to go over 15. So if I have a telescope, dedicated astronomy camera, a guide scope, a guide camera, an anti-dew strap on the telescope so I don't get dew on the lens at night, all the different cables that are attached, all of that together needs to be under 15 pounds. So you've got to keep an eye out on weight. So what's next for me? Well, my next big jump is I am going to go test out the ZWO 80mm telescope, as well as that 533 squared censored camera. And so you can see here I've really bought into ZWO with all of their various options. Now, what I don't have is a filter wheel. So some people will put on a light pollution filter. There are filters that you can get to bring out more color in the various nebula that you take pictures of. Some people prefer to take black and white pictures, and then they go into PixInsight or Photoshop, and then afterwards, that's when they add in the color. I don't have an autofocuser. That's a nice to have where it will take pictures and fine-tune the focus so that it's dead on. So you don't have to use a focus mask anymore. These are things that maybe I'll get in the future, but for now I really don't need them. So the next thing I need to do is go out on a clear night and try out this new equipment and see how it compares to using my digital camera and my Canon lens. And as I've mentioned, I'm sure it's going to end up being a lot better. So that's my journey. Hopefully you found some useful tips, and good luck. And remember, the best thing to do is actually get out there and start shooting.